You're listening to the 95 Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches.
Well, welcome back to the 95 Podcast. My name's Austin Savage. I'm here with my good friend, Dale Sellers, and we are your hosts. Dale, how you doing this fine day? It's actually super rainy here, so it's not really that fine, but maybe it's nice where you're at.
It's 85 and sunny here.
Are you serious?
In South Carolina, yeah, but it's nothing like it is on the West Coast, as I just discovered. So, but it's nice.
What is it on the West Coast?
Perfect's what I always heard. Anyway, that's what our guest said. So,
yeah, that's what he said.
Yeah.
Well, today we'll just jump right in because, we're excited.
Because this is, I will tell you, I've said this about a few podcasts.
Yeah.
This podcast, I will tell you up front, is going to be one of the most helpful podcasts we've ever done.
All right. What happens if it's not? Do people get something?
Doesn't matter. They get we'll give them a refund. They can undownload it.
Yeah, you can unsubscribe from the podcast if this isn't the best thing you've ever heard.
I didn't say it's the best thing you ever heard, but I'm just telling you,
true.
It's good stuff.
Well, we have the man himself, Karl Vaters, back for the third time on the podcast, and that's saying something. I don't think we've even had anybody else on twice.
Exactly. We've had a couple people on twice. I had Tony Morgan on twice, but
true.
that no one's been on for 3 times.
This is the first.
What does that mean? What does that mean to you, Karl?
Boy, I'm trying to process so many things right now, from the big sell for the content here, so there's no pressure on me there.
None at all. It's actually all on you. But
from the perfect weather to I'm trying to think what else. I'm grateful to be anywhere. I'm always grateful when the first invitation is nice. Mm-hmm. But number 2 means, you actually did something okay the first time, because, my most podcasts, it's a one and done. That's just the way it is. So a second and now a third invitation is actually very, very encouraging to me. So I appreciate it very much, you guys.
Yeah.
Well, I want to dive into why you're here again. And honestly, it hasn't been that long. We had him on somewhere in the pandemic, back when the pandemic happened.
Was probably a year ago, though.
But I had the opportunity a few weeks ago, Karl and I together, along with Chris, and I can't say Chris's last name very well. But,
Vitarelli.
There you go. We were together. Hey, Chris, how you doing, man? Sorry, I couldn't say your name right. Hope you're over your flu. Anyway, we had Chris on. We were together in California. We weren't in California. I hope you can edit all that out.
That's okay. Let's start over.
Here we go. We were together out in Commerce, Washington, which is near Portland, for the Big Little Church Conference. And Karl did some sessions and I did some sessions. But Karl talked about something that I thought we've got to share this with our listeners. And honestly, Karl, I've been telling everyone about it as best I can from what I remember that you said. But you talked a lot about a friend of yours that's is it a neurosurgeon? Is that right? Neurobiologist, and their understanding about how things are happening or what's happening to us right now in the midst of either the pandemic or post-pandemic or some of the other issues we have. So I would like for you just to kind of dive in and set that up and explain what you know about this, and then we'll ask you questions beyond that.
Sure. Yeah, it was actually, maybe almost a year ago now. The pandemic was coming in. It's probably 9 months ago. The pandemic was, I think, pretty much settled in. We were at the point where we knew this was going to be months and not weeks. Yeah. Remember when that moment kind of hit everybody? It was like, oh, we're not in for short-term adaptation. Right. This is going to be a long run. Even then, we didn't realize it would be as long as it's turning out to be. But at that point, it was like, okay, I got to find some help here, because we were also in the middle of all of the racial tensions of last summer and warming up to one of the most delightful political seasons of our lives. And all of that mess was all of that mess was going on. And so I all of a sudden it hit me, wait a minute, I've got this friend. And so I called a friend of mine named Lori, and she is she has a doctorate in neurobiology, and she's also spent most of her life as a small church pastor's wife as well. She's still that pastor's wife. He's just no longer a pastor. So that's why the only reason I put it in the past. But they've been friends of mine for a long time. And so I called Lori up and I asked her, would you mind talking with me about some of this? Because those are really two interesting camps to have your feet in: neurobiology and small church pastoring. I thought, and in the middle of a pandemic, that's the person I wanted to talk to.
Absolutely.
From my perspective. So I called her up and I asked her, I said, as a neurobiologist, which means her doctorate is in the physical structure of the brain, what happens to our brains when we're in trauma? And her first response was, "Thank you for using the T word." And I immediately had to stretch my brain and go, T word. I didn't know there was a T word. And she said, "Trauma. You used the word trauma." And I was like, "Yeah." She said, you wouldn't believe how many people refuse to even acknowledge that this is traumatic, that they don't believe that term applies here. I said, well, then let me start with that. Does the term trauma apply here? And she said, yeah, it absolutely does. In fact, I don't think she said this, but in further study, it occurred to me, this is the first time since World War II that the entire globe has experienced a traumatic event together.
Wow.
Right now, there have been pockets that have been far more traumatic than this. People have gone through genocide and horrors, of course, that dwarf what we're going through now. I mean, I had to sit in my house for a few months. I mean, I'll be fine. But it is global. It's the first time that the entire world has experienced it together since World War II, which is like a big moment of, okay, that makes this different. That makes this really unique. So anyway, back to my conversation with my friend. So I said, so she said, yeah. So I said, this is trauma. She said, yes, this absolutely is trauma. I said, how then does trauma affect the brain? And she said, well, there's a couple things that will be of interest to you. And she said, what happens is they get people who have been through trauma and they have them sit down, they, hook them all up with whatever monitors they do to be able to register what's happening in each part of the brain. And then they ask them, just recall your traumatic event. Tell us your story of divorce or the loss of a loved one or the accident or that your first time in battle, whatever it was. And people simply just talk through their trauma. And as they talk through their trauma, they experience low levels of that trauma in the talking through of it, right? And we've all had that experience. We're talking about something sad and we start to cry. Why am I crying? It's not happening to me now. We're re-experiencing it. Yeah. So she says, even though they're experiencing on a really low level compared to the actual living out of it, what happens in the brain is so dramatic. She said, you as a non-professional would be able to see this. It's so obvious. Wow. I said, okay, what happens? She said, what happens is there are two things that happen simultaneously. The logic parts of our brain shut down and go almost completely dark. And the action and emotion parts of our brain light up like a Christmas tree. And then she said the sentence that just blew me away. And then I think was the same for you and for the crew every time in that conference that we were at together. She said, when you are going through trauma, your brain cannot think logically. You cannot process new information. The parts of the brain that do that shut down. That's because all of the energy, it needs to go into action and emotion. So as I've been thinking it through, it occurs to me, this is what happens like in basic training. Anytime they get new recruits, they take them through basic training and they break them down emotionally, physically, and everything else. Why? So that when they face that first battle, I cannot imagine. I've never been in the military. I can't imagine what it would be like to face that first battle. And all of a sudden people are shooting at you and you're supposed to shoot at them and all of the horror that goes along with that. And she said, they've known even before the neurobiology told us that, they know because of behavior that at that point, that soldier is incapable of processing new information and thinking logically. So what do? You train their muscle memory so that the actions and emotions that are lighting up like crazy and all the energy is going into there, let's direct their action and emotions towards the action that we want them to be. They've got all this rage, they've got all this fear. Let's direct it through the action center into making sure they know how to operate their weapon, that to defend themselves, to march in a row together into battle. That's why they march and march and march and march like crazy. Why are we marching so much in basic training? Because at some point you're going to be in the first battle and you're going to have to keep marching into it. And we're going to make sure your muscle memory takes over when you're not able to think logically anymore. So she said, that's where everybody is right now. So she says, everybody you meet right now through pandemic, and I'm convinced for years coming out of it, we are going to be in trauma or in post-trauma recovery. Everybody you meet is in some level of trauma. And then what happened over the season, as we already talked about a little bit, it was one trauma of the shutdowns, then another trauma hit us of the racial unrest, and then another trauma up there, toppling statues, and then another trauma of there was probably 4 or 5 traumas last year that none of us can remember off the top of our heads that in any normal year would have been the headline of the year.
Yes,
right?
sir.
It was hitting us on a weekly or at least almost a daily basis for a little while. So you're in different levels of recovery on different levels of trauma.
Wow.
So we get to the point where our logic centers, which are shutting down anyway, some of us are just kind of like, we just kind of give up, and everybody's acting on emotion right now.
Wow.
And everybody wants to act. You want to do something. That's why our action centers are lit up. Our emotion centers are lit up. So everybody's running around like crazy. They're all emotional about it, and nobody's making any sense. That explains the last year better than anything I have ever heard.
This is exactly why I wanted you on here talking about this.
Yeah.
If we just shut the podcast down now, that's already been great, because it explains so much. I know for me personally, I was trying to keep up with the newscast and everything when this thing started happening, and then it just got so crazy. I just cut it all off. I couldn't take anymore. Does that play into this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It becomes overwhelming. But since World War II, the closest thing we've had to this would be maybe 9/11. But 9/11 had a couple very distinct differences from this. One, it was a clear attack from an outside force. It was a single attack that we all recovered from together, rather than multiple things happening one upon another, upon another, upon another. And so when all of that brought us together, it united us, right? I mean, we've never had more unity in my lifetime than we did in the months post 9/11. But this one has done exactly the opposite. It's fractured us.
Yeah.
And it's because when you have multiple traumas, your brain first of all, the brain can't process even the first one. And then when you get multiples, you just shut down. Last year, 2020, I read, since I was a kid, I've read probably 100 books a year. I just always have a book. I'm always reading something. And
that's why you're so
last
smart.
I'm trying to get there anyway.
Okay.
And last year, I don't think I read 5 books. I'd pick up a book and I'd read a page, and then I'd pause and I'd go, I have no idea what I just read. And I'd read it again. I have no idea what I just read. Read it again. And that was just like, I'll just watch Hamilton again. I can't process it.
Yeah, that's real though. Yeah.
And so, right. And so that's what happened to a whole lot of us last year. And we're thinking there must be something wrong with me. Why can't I, right? Well, we got all this time at home. I'm going to get all this done. And none of us got anything done. Why? Because our logic centers went dark. We are neurobiologically incapable of processing new information during those seasons.
And so that affects our ability to make decisions, correct?
Yes. Yeah. And especially to make new decisions. Let's put it that way. Because again, back to the talk about, boot camp and then going into that first battle, they can make decisions in that battle as long as those are decisions in lining with their previous training, their muscle memory training. So our long-term stuff, the stuff that we're used to, the stuff that we already know, we can make decisions in those areas. But anything that's coming along that's new at all, completely it overwhelms us, and so we lock it out. And that's another reason why so many people have locked down over partisan and ideological lines in this past year. And you can't get they make a decision that you look at and go, that makes no sense to me whatsoever. And in fact, it makes no sense whatsoever. And it's simply because whatever track they were in when this thing began, they just dug it deeper, because that's the only way we know. It's all action, all emotion. We can't process new information coming in, and the emotional and mental energy that it takes to get out of this one rut to move over to another way of processing this information in a different way. It's just overwhelming.
So the safety is basically just shutting down. I mean, that because you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the people. And this is true. And the reason this is so fascinating, this speaks to everybody. This is not a church
Absolutely.
thing. This is not a specific camping church. This is not a political. This is us as people, and it's not even just Americans. This is a worldwide
Yep.
issue that's happening.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's global and it's pervasive. And the other part of it is, if it was something like a 9/11 or like a World War II, where the conflict is singular and obvious, then this explanation I'm giving to you would be accepted more widely than it is. But there's a lot of folks, your friends or your timeline friends online, who are going to look at it and go, I'm not under trauma. No, I'm not fine. I'm processing everything just fine. What do you mean? No, it's not a stupid mistake. No, of course that theory, right? Because it's subtle. It's not actual battle. And right, that's why we got some people who are just dismissive of it. It's like, just a bunch of pansies or snowflakes or whatever term they want to use, right? You can't, you're not strong enough to be able to handle this. And it's like, that's their denial of their trauma, because they can't handle that either. And because it came in these subtle waves rather than in this big, massive hit, the trauma is less obvious to us. That was the first thing that my friend said, right? I'm glad you used the T word. Why aren't people even willing to acknowledge that it's traumatic? Because it didn't hit like a battle or an accident or, an immediate death in the family. And, especially if you haven't had COVID or you haven't had someone who passed away from COVID, to you, it's all, there's still a lot of people that are going as much ado about nothing.
Mhm.
And, wherever you are on how well we've reacted to this governmentally or church-wise or whatever, there's all kinds of valid debates to be had there. But to deny that this has been a traumatic time for the last year or so is just head in the sand.
Yeah. Austin, I know you got a bunch of questions, so I'm gonna let you get yours in because I've got somewhere I want to go. So
That's fine. So just to get specific, Karl, for church leaders, what
That's
are the
my question.
implications? There you go.
What are the implications? Okay. Implication number one, you are experiencing trauma too.
Mm-hmm.
Do not jump so quickly into helping others mode before you help yourself. And I hate to use the analogy, especially now, because it sounds so different, but put your own mask on first.
It does sound I pictured something different.
I know, right?
He's talking about an airplane, folks. He's talking
The
about
airplane.
an
That's what I'm talking about. I mean the airplane thing. Yeah.
Do airplanes still exist? I don't remember.
35 people just turned it off.
I know, right? Yeah, that's why. That's why.
But they're not in trauma.
Right. Yeah.
There's a good one. Boom, mic drop right there. So yeah, take care of yourself first. Recognize you are experiencing trauma. And again, if you're saying no, I'm not, it's likely because you're having a hard time processing the reality of that, because trauma is hard to acknowledge. To say I'm weak is hard, especially for those of us who are supposed to be helping others. We're servers.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be there for others. And for us to start by saying, first of all, I'm worn out, I'm tired, I'm weak, I'm having a hard time doing this. But we have to do that. We have to take care of ourselves first. So that's the first implication. Pastor, church leader, parent, whatever leadership capacity you are in, take care of yourself. Make sure that you're doing well, or you've got nothing else to hand to anybody else. Secondly, lean on each other. You cannot, there's depending on our personality, our character, and our background, and all kinds of other things, there's some of us who instantly, when trauma happens, we're going to carry the whole burden ourselves. It's going to be all on my shoulders. I'm going to carry this family through, or this church through, or whatever. And no, you can't do it by yourself. Small church pastors especially, too many of us have already been doing practically everything in the church already, and this has absolutely wiped out a whole lot of us. I'm absolutely convinced that as we begin to come out of this, we're going to see more pastoral resignations and church closures than we've ever seen in any season in our lifetime. And a lot of that could have been avoided if we had allowed ourselves to acknowledge our weakness, first to ourselves, then to others, and support each other, rather than trying to be the answer for everybody in the church. But again, if that's kind of the mode you've been in, if you've already been in the rut of, I do everything in this church, pandemic hits, you just go deeper into that rut. Instead of changing lanes. It's hard to change lanes in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of trauma. So all of a sudden, to all of a sudden become a team-based leadership style in your church when you've been doing it all yourself, virtually impossible to happen in the middle of the emergency.
I want to dive into that for just a second, because we had Rich Birch on a few weeks ago, and he talked about he opened his podcast by talking about the fact that right now it looks like about 20% of our committed volunteers are not coming back at this moment. Doesn't mean that they won't eventually, but at this moment they're not coming back. And so, and you and I talked about this when we were together. What I'm extremely concerned about, and see, I'm beginning to recognize that the second wave of this thing, which is going to be more emotional, not as easy to see, may be more impactful than the first wave, because in the small church, you already do everything anyway. And now if you did have a few key volunteers and they don't come back, I know what you'll do, because I did this. I was a small church pastor too. You take on the roles of the things that are not getting done, but then you don't give them back up in the future. And so this is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And which is where this goes next. That's the third thing then is when we need to let those who have been our volunteers know they are not just allowed, but welcome and encouraged to come back, even if they have nothing to offer. I have had these conversations already with our high energy volunteers that we haven't seen come back already. And I've actually talked to some of them and said, what's up? How are you doing? And I'm just not ready. I don't know why. And I've broached the subject. I've said, do you feel like if you come back, you're just going to be put to work and you just don't have the energy for it? And after you open the door for it, they admit it. They go, yeah, I guess that's what it is. And I've told them this: we want you here more than we want your work ethic here. You have not just full permission, but encouragement to come, to sit, to rest, to worship, and to receive for as long as you need before you have to feel any commitment to give back in again. You need to rest. Having your presence here is more important than putting your time in volunteer work. And
I want to make sure people know, Karl, that when you talk about, you actually still are serving at your church, even though you're doing the national ministry helping churches. So if someone's listening, go, wait a minute, what's he talking about? You still are working with a church, and you are still working with. So I wanted to make sure people understood that. So continue there, please.
Yeah. So I'm talking to people in our local congregation that I've been here for 28 years. I've had long-term relationships with these folks. And that has been such a release for them. And so our percentages, I mean, we don't do the counts. That's the other thing. In a smaller church, percentage counts have such a wide range that they almost become useless. Yeah. But we have from what we can see, a really high percentage of people coming back compared to most. And some of that is because we've told them that. Now, how do you do that? How do you let them know, hey, you don't have to? Because it sounds to me like, Pastor, I'm just going to have to keep doing it more. No, here's the way you do it. You don't do as much now. Be really, really, really slow to bring stuff back in again. Mm-hmm. If you've been a year maybe doing very little, maybe just one service, and maybe that service was only online for a little while, and you got all these programs, and you think as a pastor that we won't be whole again until all these programs are back in place. Well, if you rush to put those programs back in place again, you will never get whole, because it will rip you to shreds in all kinds of different directions with a smaller volunteer base than the already stretched volunteer base that you had before. Mm-hmm. So what's the answer? The answer is be really, really, really slow to bring those programs back again. And in fact,
here we go.
Looking around, what's that?
I said, here we go. Go ahead. I know where you're going now.
Here it comes. If you looking around and you had to stop a program for the last year and nobody's really missing it, maybe you just don't start it again.
Yep.
And see, here's the thing. Milk this, folks. You can blame the pandemic for the next 5 years. Just say, oh yeah, 5 years from now when you stop doing, oh yeah, it was the pandemic. Just blame the pandemic. But I knew you were going there. It's like some of these things we were doing before this were ineffective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for years we've been saying, right? I know I've been saying, you guys have been saying it as well. Simplify, simplify, simplify. Yes. Churches are overprogrammed. Small churches are way overprogrammed. That is just statistically true. We're trying to do too much stuff because we've convinced ourselves that if the big church is doing all that stuff, the way for us to get better is for us to do all the stuff that the big church is doing, and we're killing ourselves trying to accomplish that. That's not the answer. What we need to do as small churches, and we've been saying it for years, right, is do one or two things and lean into them and give it your all and do it well. Yes. And there will never be a better opportunity to put that into play than right now.
Yes.
because restarting a program that you're not doing is easier than stopping a program while you're doing it.
Yeah. Talk to the pastor who has already gone too fast and brought stuff back like almost to full capacity.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. That's a challenge. You're going to have to step back and recalibrate, because if you've done that already, then you've almost certainly done what Dale mentioned, which is you've taken it all on yourself. And now, as you were running at 90%, and now you're trying to run at 100%, and it will not last. So you need to look at it. You need to reassess the decisions that you've made. And you may need to look back at it and go, okay, for right now, given our limited capacity, emotionally, and with time and with everything, we've got limited capacity in every way. Let's slow down a little bit. Let's give people a chance to come back and heal, including you, Pastor, yourself.
Yes.
Now, I am fully aware that doing that in a relatively healthy church is one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to do that in a toxic church is a completely different process.
Yep.
I understand that, but in a toxic church, it's going to be more necessary than in the healthy church, because in the healthy church, part of it being healthy is that you do have the emotional support of the congregation behind you to do that, and so you can handle more. But in the toxic church, where you're not just having their support, but you in fact have their antagonism,
Mm-hmm.
that's even more reason why you need to step back, recalibrate, and try to do less, because the energy drain from the antagonism of a toxic church is that's more than enough for you to handle on your own, without adding a whole bunch of programs back again that now you have to take even more control over than ever before.
One of the things that Rich also said when we talked to him was there's a lot of research showing that some pastors have not had a Sunday off since the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
Yep.
Especially in our small church settings, they have not even taken a vacation or a Sunday off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I just want to say to you, Pastor, if you're doing that, there's a crash waiting. I mean, you are going down the interstate and you're running about there's the bridge out signs, and you're going to go off that bridge if you don't stop. And I want to go into something else too, Karl. I want to get your opinion on this. So if I've been doing this and I know that I'm emotionally fried and I know that I'm on the edge and I'm in a toxic church and I don't see a way out, what would you do?
Well, I'll tell you what I did when I was as close to this as I ever want to be in my life, and I didn't have a pandemic on top of everything else. But you know, the season that I went through about 10 to 12 years ago that eventually led to me doing this ministry of reaching out to others. I went to a local, pastoral counselor and sat down with him. And after going through all of my trauma and walking through, here's my burnout and here's all the stuff that I'm facing. And he looked at me after 2 or 3 sessions with him, and he looked at me and says, Karl, what do you want? And I felt these words falling out of my face. I said, I have to figure out how to fall in love with Jesus again.
Mm-hmm.
And until I said it, I didn't know it. But the moment I said it, I knew it. And we can't program our way out of this.
Mm-hmm.
We can't counsel our way out of this. Although, the counseling helped me. I had left my first love.
Mm-hmm.
I was the Ephesian church in Revelation. And I had to get back to that. There's no programmatic way of doing this. We have to get back to our first love again. We have to figure out how to fall in love with Jesus again. That's the only solution to any of this. And pastors, it has to start in our hearts first. If our people see us trying to program our way out of this, they'll follow our example. If they see us falling in love with Jesus again, they'll follow our example.
Mm.
And the answer to a toxic church, while there are all kinds of programmatic helps, and you and I, we all teach them, underneath all of it is, if you're not connecting with the love of your heart and constantly restoring that on a daily basis in a relationship with Jesus, then we've got nothing to build the programs on. That's where we gotta go.
And the end result is they don't work. I went through the exact same thing. In fact, one of the things that I had to do after we went through a horrible church split, and then we hung on for 4 more years, but I was done. And so I took 5 years off and went into construction and just attended church. Went to a church, volunteered, served in the youth ministry. I didn't walk away from my love for the Lord of church, but I didn't have anything to offer. And one of the things that happened to me was studying the Bible was I didn't enjoy it anymore. I didn't enjoy any of the spiritual disciplines. I didn't enjoy any of it. And so, and I know some of our listeners may not, they don't like the New Modern Translations. And so you can ignore this part, but I love the Message translation because it's written in today's language. And I'm a simple person, as y'all know. But what I did was I took the copy of the Message and I read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when I finished, I went back Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when I finished, I did that for a year. And all I read was the Gospels. I didn't prepare any sermons, none of that stuff. And I just fell in love with Jesus all over again. Yeah. And I also got a very clear image, and I knew this to be true, but I got an even clearer image. But really, the only people Jesus couldn't get along with were religious people.
Yeah.
And so if you're in a toxic situation, you're probably having the same problems, but Jesus came to it from a place of health. Jesus withdrew often. Yep. He got off by himself. He went and he was replenished. He did have compassion on the masses, but he modeled for us pulling away, getting apart, and refreshing and replenishing. A lot of you listening right now, you haven't done that yet. And Karl's been in ministry for a long time, and I've been in ministry for a long time, and both of us reached the same place because if you keep giving and you keep giving and you keep giving, eventually you're going to run out.
Yeah. And what we're talking about really comes back to where this whole thing started, which is don't try to think your way out of this thing. Your logic centers are impaired anyway.
Yeah. That's exactly
so
right.
Don't try to think your way out of this. It's action and emotion. So what action and emotion is it? It's the action of coming back to Jesus, the emotion of reconnecting with who he is. Even in our churches, like you just said, you read through the Gospels again. Our series that we're starting, that we're going to go through 3 months of the summer, we are not going to try to explain things to people. We're doing a series on the parables. We're going to spend 3 months retelling the stories that Jesus told. They're all familiar. We know all of them. It's not going to be any new stuff. But when people are in trauma, that's what they need. Their actions and their emotion centers. We need some spiritual comfort food.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about physical comfort food, it's usually bad for us. It just makes us feel good in the moment. But spiritual comfort food,
let's don't go there now.
Yeah.
leave that alone.
I've gone there way too many times in the past year. Trust me. Right. But spiritual comfort food means like what you just did. Let's go back to the Gospels again. Let's go back to the parables again. Let's look at who Jesus is again. And to do that, we can't do that while rescheduling all the programs again. We have to simplify to do that. Because and our logic centers aren't going to be able to process the new stuff anyway. So let's, if we're going to go back to the familiar, let's make the one decision to go back to the familiar things that we know in fact are going to help us. Don't go into familiar bad habits again, which we've done enough of over the past year with too much, screen time and too much overeating or whatever, right? Guilty party right here, right? But there are other familiar things like worship. Well, here's one of the things that my friend Lori told me, the neurobiologist. I said, so what do we do when we come back if people can't process logic and they can only do action and emotion? She says, well, you got to give them healthy actions and emotions. You got to shorten your preaching and you got to lengthen your worship session.
Say that again.
Shorten your preaching and lengthen your worship.
Yeah.
Because worship is about action and emotion. All those new songs that everybody says that repeat the same words over and over again. There's a reason why the words in the Psalms get repeated over and over again.
Yes.
Because when people are in trauma, they need to do the singing. They need to sing. They need to express it, but they can't process a whole bunch of complex words. So those, the chorus that's familiar that says, "We love you, Jesus," over and over and over again, go back to that. Action and emotion. And the logic will catch up eventually after the healing happens. But we need longer times in worship and shorter sermons. And in our sermons, let's not try to process all of the Greek tenses out of the word study so much. And we're still doing Bible study. We're not abandoning any of that. But on Sunday morning, for the people who haven't been there for a while, we're just going to retell the stories that Jesus told, because that's about all we can process right now. But that's enough right now. That's more than enough right now.
I want to lean into this even a little further. One of the things I really want to encourage you to do is, if you have favorite songs, if you have songs that your congregation just dives into, pull those up. Even if they're older songs, this is not the time to be introducing a lot of new songs. Because people, they only have so much time, no matter how long your service is. And I'm not saying it's wrong to do new songs. It's comforting right now to, one of the things that's gotten me through the pandemic, every morning of my life, I've got a playlist. It would drive Austin bananas, because every day, because he's a musician, every day of my life, I've got a playlist of 30 songs. I hit shuffle. And every day I listen to the same songs over and over.
There's some old ones in there.
And over. Oh, there is some old ones in there. And I've added some new ones. I love this new stuff that's being put out by Elevation and Maverick. I think it's called Maverick City or something. Whew, my goodness, there's some good stuff coming out.
Yeah.
Graves in the Gardens came out. I listened to that one over and over and over and over. But what I'm saying is, yes, there are some good new things, but we've got to find a place to land. And it goes totally in agreement with what you've been saying about doing what you already know to do. And so let's not overcomplicate things as we try to figure things out. And I think, and I want you to speak to this, I think probably the tendency we have as leaders is we just want to get things going again as quick as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. When people come out of trauma, they need to do three things. They need to do familiar things in familiar places with familiar people. Familiar things in familiar places with familiar people. Now, if left to our own devices, and if any of us, if we do that subconsciously, we will choose some unhealthy familiar things with some unhealthy familiar people in some unhealthy familiar places.
True.
So one of the things we can do as church leaders is to guide people into healthy relationships again, into healthy places again, doing healthy things again. So don't complicate it. Look at the basic disciplines of the Christian life, fellowship and worship, and when we can finally do it, eating again together, whatever that is, familiar things, familiar places, familiar people. But we get the opportunity to guide them to do that in a healthy way. So, get out from the TV that has become overly familiar, that Netflix queue that's become overly familiar this past year. And let's get back into something that used to be familiar, which is actually gathering with God's people and lifting our voices in worship and praise again.
You said one of the things you told when we were together was you talked about how when your church got together, the music, the people sang louder. They, I remember you saying those.
Yeah, we've been able to do a triple hybrid in California. We had an outdoor option, an indoor option, and an online option. So we had almost everybody, together, but they weren't actually together. They were, at the same time, but not in the same place. And so Good Friday was kind of our launch. We're all back together physically in the same room again. We were able to do it with proper safety guidelines and everything else. And on Good Friday, the worship in our little room was so loud that at the times when the band, dropped out just to have the voices, part of the way the song was going, it was so loud, and I could almost feel it. The volume. I actually talked to the sound guy afterwards, and he said, "Yeah, the EQ meter, the decibel meter, was actually in the red after the band dropped out."
Wow.
Well, that's
how loud the singing was, and we've always been a very involved, passionate singing church. I keep hearing all the stuff about nobody's singing anymore. I'm going, we sing like crazy in our church. But that was an overwhelming moment that I will remember for the rest of my life. It was just people needed to be there, and they needed their voices to be heard, and they needed to do it in worship of Jesus.
So good.
Karl, I loved hearing a little bit of your story earlier, and thank you for sharing some of that. And I think that there was probably a few leaders who were listening who felt who just felt like they're where you were at 10 to 12 years ago. And I think wrapped into that is a recognition that they are there. Like, they know that they're tired. They know that they're hurting. They know that they're exhausted. But at the same time, they're scared because, one, if they open up about that, it's scary from a leadership perspective of what will my church think of me. It might even be scary from a marriage perspective. What will my spouse think of me? Scary from a job perspective of what if they fire me? All of those things are wrapped up into the recognition of I need a break. What should they do next?
Yeah. For years, I worked with the Ministry of Teen Challenge. It's now called Adult and Teen Challenge. It's a drug, alcohol, gang recovery started by David Wilkerson back in the 50s. And when I would spend my time with them, every time I was with them to do a chapel or whatever, I always knew there was at least a few people in the room who were who were coming into it going, after this chapel, I'm walking in and I'm quitting this program. I'm out of here. It's just too hard. There's always going to be somebody in the room like that when you're in a drug rehab recovery situation, especially. So almost every time I would speak to them, I would say this: I know some of you are thinking of leaving, but here's the reality of life. I'm going to give you 3 words that are going to be true for your entire life. Life is hard. It's not a matter of life is hard in Teen Challenge, and if I leave, it'll get easy. There's a reason you're here. It wasn't because your life was roses and ponies, right? You came here because your life was hard outside Teen Challenge. And now guess what? Life is hard inside Teen Challenge. But here's the difference. Life in Teen Challenge is hard on the way up. Life outside Teen Challenge will be hard on the way down. And that's the choice we have. And life in ministry is the same thing. So pastors, here, 3 words for you. Ministry is hard. It's not a matter of I quit and everything and my life gets easier. No, you're either going, you pick your hard. That's really the choice here. Choose your hard. So here's the deal. You can continue to try to hobble along and trying to do everything for everybody else and be afraid of making the very, very difficult decisions of admitting your weaknesses and cutting programs back and simplifying. You can do that hard, or you can continue to do the hard of trying to juggle all of that stuff and not getting healthy yourself. At the end of one is guaranteed loss and guaranteed burnout if you continue to try to juggle it. At the end of the other one, it might still be loss and you might still lose your position. But in that other way, in the hard on the way up and the hard on the process of rebuilding, there is at least the hope and the possibility of recovery and of restoration and of health again. So choose your hard. Choose your hard that has the possibility of recovery, or choose your hard that will just continue to go downhill like it's been currently going downhill. There's no easy out on this one. There's no easy in ministry. You got to choose your hard.
And you're going to have to reach out for help. You are not going to do anything to make this work on your own.
Yeah. And that's usually the first step in the hard work of getting out of this. Is that it was my first step. I had to ask for help. 10, 12 years ago, the story that I told you about, the first thing I had to do was I had to go to my wife and I had to tell her, here's where I am really emotionally, this stuff I've been trying to cover up even from you. And her response was like, oh, finally you're saying it. Like it wasn't a secret to her. Right. And, she gave me this wonderful, soft place to land. And then I had to go and I had to tell our church leaders the same thing. Here's where I am. Here's the hurt. Here's the pain. And thank God I was in a relatively healthy church where they helped me give that soft place to land. And they asked, what do you need? And I walked away for 40 days, because that it's the only number that I kept finding in the Bible. And they allowed me to do that. And if they had not allowed me to do that, I'd have taken it anyway.
Yeah.
Because on the path I was on, it was just destruction anyway. So it might as well be destruction while taking a break. Instead of destruction while working myself into the destruction. And I want to say this, I could have found myself getting healthy if I'd done that. Yeah.
I want to say this to you too, Pastor. If you're in this position right now, what you'll tend to do is kind of like the insecure pastor. You'll spend about 75% of your energy trying to cover up where the pain is. You'll spend, if you're insecure, you'll spend a great deal more time trying to hide where you're insecure from your congregation than just learning and developing, and you wear yourself out. If you're in this place emotionally that we've talked about today, where, you're in, when we started talking and he mentioned the word trauma, you knew that related to you. But if you're not willing to reach out for help, you're going to spend an inordinate amount of energy trying your best to cover it up. And it's just going to make it worse. So hopefully one of the goals I had with this podcast today was I would love for this to be just a marker in people's lives where they go, you know what, because of that podcast and because of what Karl was sharing today, I give up. I just can't keep doing this. I've got to reach out for help.
Yeah, absolutely. We are, especially as pastors, we're fixers, we're helpers, and we get to the point of codependency, and we get into some really, really unhealthy places. And bottom line is, it's kind of an arrogance. We think we're Jesus. Or at least we act like we think we're Jesus. We're the place where everybody's going to get all their answers from. No, we're all seeking answers at the same place, and it's not us.
There you go.
We're the first. We should be just the first ones to arrive at the well. We are not the well.
Karl, give us an update on your ministry and how people can get in touch with you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. Well, in the last year, I changed over from newsmallchurch.com to karlvaters.com.
Which was a great move, by the way.
Thank you.
Great move.
Thank you. Yeah, I really, I struggled with that because I hate putting my name and face on stuff.
Get it? I understand.
But it was friends like you, Dale, and Austin and others who basically told me people don't connect with a brand name. People connect with people. Yeah. And so put your name on this thing. So in some situations like 95 Network, it works to have that. But for me, it was just one of those I had to pull the trigger. So karlvaters.com. We're there, and I've started doing some how-to videos, simple things like, in fact, I'm working right now. I'm going to do a multiple stage how-to video on how to put together a simple church website. We've got how to use Zoom, how to do some of the technical stuff that are there. Starting a podcast in a couple weeks.
Yes, you are.
It's going to be called "Can This Work in a Small Church?"
Yeah.
And I interviewed Austin already, and we may have to redo it, Austin.
What?
I know.
You broke it?
I've never heard this happen before. Your half is perfect. My half,
just kidding.
No, yeah, of course it is. My half, it sounds, when you're listening to something half speed, that low sound that it has.
Yeah,
it's actually regular speed, but it sounds like I've never heard anything like it before.
So I want to go ahead and recommend Karl. He's putting all this stuff out for you guys to learn.
Yeah,
from. So there's a great example.
He's the expert. No, just kidding.
And there we go. I can't even record my own voice correctly. But
That's
the one
hilarious.
that you and I, Dale, along with Chris and the Cullies, we set up a simple mic in a trailer in a camper in a campground, and it worked perfectly. All that audio is great.
That's hilarious.
So Can This Work in a Small Church is the podcast. It'll be coming out soon.
Two resources that we have that I think would be helpful for pastors today, and that is your book, 100 Days to a Healthier Church. That book, and then the book that I wrote called Stalled. If you just learned of us or whatever, check out those two resources because they will definitely help you. And honestly, Karl is just a river of wisdom, and I hope you guys will connect with him. And I'm so thankful for our friendship and what God's doing and all the opportunities that we've had in the past. We got some really cool ones coming up in the future.
Yeah, we really do.
It's really nice. And one of the things I said to you in a recent call is I just love the fact that we get to model not being competitive with each other, but actually working with each other and highlighting each other, getting each other's back, because that helps the church.
It really does.
And that's our heart.
I hope I know we will be able to continue to do this. And I hope just by the simple example, there's no competition here. Look at all the small churches in the world. Look how few resources there are. This is a large pool. There's room for plenty more fish. and we are working to create networks of partners who can help each other and help the small church, because I really believe we're heading into a small church moment. Yes. Where people are going to start looking for the fellowship that they missed, and they're going to want it in a smaller, intimate venue more than they did in the past.
Yes.
So we need to prepare our nets for this. And that's a phrase I've heard all my life: prepare your nets, some big revival's coming. And then, dud, nothing happens. So I'm really slow to say those kinds of things, but there's no question this is a big shift in our culture, and people are wanting the closeness and intimacy of friendship and relationship. They're recognizing their need for it more than ever before. And I don't know a better place to get healthy relationships than in a healthy small church.
That's so good.
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.